When Hollywood's toughest guy sits down for a friendly morning show interview, nobody expects sparks to fly. But when George Stephanopoulos decides to poke the bear, even Mark Wahlberg's legendary patience has its limits. A simple promo appearance for his new movie turns into one of live television's most uncomfortable and unforgettable showdowns. This is the story of how one question too many pushed Mark Wahlberg out of his chair and off the set. The Good Morning America studio bustled as usual, bright lights gleaming off polished floors, producers whispering last-minute instructions into earpieces. It was a textbook morning for George Stephanopoulos and his crew, until Mark Wahlberg walked onto the set. Dressed sharp in a navy suit and tie, Wahlberg looked every bit the movie star as he shook hands with Stephanopoulos and settled into his chair. He was there to promote his newest movie, an action thriller that critics were already calling a return to form for the actor. "Good morning, Mark. Thanks for being here," George began, flashing that seasoned, slightly rehearsed smile of his. "Always a pleasure, George. Happy to talk about the film," Wahlberg replied with a confident grin, adjusting his cufflinks. The first few minutes of the interview went as expected. Wahlberg talked about his preparation for the role, the grueling physical training, and how much he'd enjoyed working with his co-stars. Clips from the movie flashed on the monitors behind them, showcasing Mark's signature blend of tough guy grit and emotional depth. But then George leaned forward slightly, shuffling his cue cards, and the mood began to shift. "Mark," he began smoothly, "you've played this kind of role, a hardened hero, fighting against the odds, many times. Some might say you've been playing the same character for over a decade now. Do you ever worry that you're typecasting yourself?" The question drew a faint murmur from the crew. Wahlberg blinked, then chuckled softly, though his eyes hardened just a touch. "I think every role I take brings something new," he replied evenly. "Sure, there are themes I gravitate toward, honor, redemption. But I try to make each character unique, and audiences seem to appreciate that." George nodded thoughtfully but pressed on. "But you don't think maybe Hollywood has moved on? Your last few films haven't exactly set the box office on fire. Some critics have said your work lately feels, well, dated. How do you respond to that?" This time Wahlberg's jaw tightened noticeably. He shifted slightly in his chair, the smile fading. "Well," he began carefully, "look, not every movie is going to be a billion-dollar franchise, but I'm proud of my work. I've never been afraid of taking risks, even if the returns aren't always huge. Not everything's about numbers, George." There was a flicker of something in George's expression, a smirk perhaps, that Wahlberg seemed to catch. "I understand what you're saying," George said, leaning back slightly. "But some would argue that taking these smaller, less impactful roles is a way to stay relevant when you're no longer at the top of your game. Do you ever wonder if your time as a leading man is behind you?" That question landed like a punch. Wahlberg's lips pressed into a thin line. His response was measured but sharp. "George," he said flatly, "if you think I've lost a step, maybe you should come train with me for a day. I don't think you'd keep up." The audience gave a nervous laugh, but George didn't miss a beat. "Oh, I don't doubt your fitness, Mark," he said lightly. "But this isn't about gym routines. This is about whether the industry still sees you as a draw." Wahlberg's eyes narrowed just slightly, but he held his tongue, choosing instead to give George a faint, humorless smile. "Well, the people who hire me still seem to think I have something to offer," he said finally. "And more importantly, so do audiences." George nodded again, his expression thoughtful, but his next words hinted that this was far from over. "That may be," George said slowly, tapping his index card against the desk. "But some of your peers and critics have started questioning whether you're occupying roles that could go to younger, fresher talent. That all the money and accolades you've earned might actually be holding others back. How do you respond to that?" Wahlberg froze for half a beat, the question clearly landing harder than he'd anticipated. When he did respond, his voice was still calm, but his Boston edge was starting to show. "I don't think anyone should apologize for success, George. And I don't think stepping aside just because someone else wants what you have is the right answer either. I earned everything I've got, and nobody handed me a damn thing." For the first time since the interview began, The atmosphere turned genuinely tense. Even the camera operators seemed to hesitate, glancing at each other as the two men locked eyes. And just like that, everyone watching knew. This was no longer about a movie promo. This was about pride. This was about two men with very different definitions of success, and neither willing to back down. When you back a man into a corner, even the calmest can turn fierce. And on live television, that corner came fast. Viewers had tuned in for a harmless promo. What they got instead was a slow-motion train wreck they couldn't look away from. The camera red light glowed hot as George adjusted his notes, his professional smile thinning ever so slightly. Mark sat rigid now, his knuckles whitening against his knee under the desk. "So," George began again, his tone deceptively light, "you've been making movies a long time now. But let's be honest, your last few haven't exactly broken box office records, have they? Do you ever worry you're just cashing in on your name at this point?" A murmur went through the studio audience. Mark's jaw clenched as he shifted his weight in the chair, but he forced a tight smile. "I'd say my track record speaks for itself," Mark replied evenly. "Not every film has to be a billion-dollar superhero circus to matter. Some movies are about telling stories, not just selling tickets." George's eyebrows arched. "But isn't that a bit of a convenient excuse? I mean, you're still paid like a blockbuster star even when the movies don't perform like blockbusters. Don't you think that's a little unfair to actors who are actually bringing in the audiences?" Mark leaned back slightly, staring at George with cool, piercing eyes. "That's an interesting take, George. I'd say I've earned what I make. Decades of hard work, dedication, and proving myself, not to mention the fact that even my flops, as you call them, still connect with people. But hey," he added dryly, "it's easy to throw the stones from behind a desk." George pressed on, ignoring the jab. "But don't you see? When you're commanding these massive paychecks for roles that anyone else could probably play better, or at least cheaper, you're taking opportunities away from newer, hungrier talent." That was a line too far. Mark's head tilted, his smile gone now. He drew in a measured breath. "You're entitled to your opinion, George," he said slowly, his voice dropping a register. "But I don't remember you on set at 4 a.m. or spending months in the gym or meeting with the real people behind these stories to make sure we got it right. So maybe hold off on telling me what I don't deserve." George didn't flinch. "But that's just it, isn't it? These characters you play, they're all the same. The tough guy from the streets who solves everything with his fists. Is that really acting, Mark? Or just a version of you dressed up for different movies?" The studio fell completely silent. Even the camera operators froze as the tension thickened like fog. Mark sat still, visibly swallowing the knot in his throat. When he finally spoke, it was with a quiet calm that was somehow more menacing than shouting. "You're pushing, George. I know you've got a job to do, but you're pushing into places you don't understand." George leaned forward slightly, sensing the shift but undeterred. "But don't you think that's the point of journalism? To ask the questions people are thinking but you don't want to hear? Like this one, do you really believe you're a better actor than the roles you keep playing?" Mark's eyes darkened as his jaw tightened. His voice came out low and deliberate. "I believe I'm the kind of actor who shows up, who tells stories people relate to, who doesn't need to prove anything to someone hiding behind a teleprompter." George smirked faintly but pressed harder. "And yet those stories always seem to center on violence. The strong man saving the day. In this day and age, do you really think that glorifying violence is the message audiences need?" Mark blinked slowly. The question hung in the air like a hammer about to drop. "That's what you think I do? Glorify violence?" he asked, incredulity creeping into his voice. "Well," George continued, his tone sharp now, "when you're consistently showing audiences that the solution to conflict is to punch harder, shoot straighter, or kill quicker. What else would you call it? Art?" Mark's chair scraped faintly against the floor as he leaned forward, forearms resting on his knees. "You want to talk about violence?" he said, his tone finally cracking into something colder. "You sit here in your suit, throwing words around like they don't mean anything. But for some people, violence isn't a choice. It's survival. And the stories I tell, they show people that even if you're backed into a corner, you can fight your way out. George raised his hand slightly, as if in surrender, but his voice stayed firm. Or you're teaching them that every problem can be solved with their fists. Mark straightened suddenly, his calm evaporating. His voice now carried a dangerous edge. You don't know what the hell you're talking about, George. You don't know what it's like to live that life, to climb out of it, to make something of yourself despite all of it. But sure, sit here, behind your safe little desk, and tell me I'm the problem. George adjusted his tie, but his smirk betrayed him. If you can't handle tough questions, Mark, maybe you shouldn't come on shows like this. Mark's lips parted into a humorless grin. He reached up and slowly unclipped his microphone. Oh, don't worry, George, he said evenly. I think this conversation's over. The studio air practically crackled with tension as Mark placed the microphone neatly on the desk. But he didn't stand just yet. Not yet. Go ahead, George said after a long pause. Walk out. That's what you heroes do when someone calls them out. Mark's hands flexed on the armrests. His nostrils flared. But instead of an explosion, there was only a chilling calm in his reply. You're going to regret saying that, he said quietly. And then finally he rose to his full height, towering over George in the stunned studio. Without another word, he turned toward the exit, the cameras tracking every step. The silence was deafening. And the viewers at home? They were glued to their screens. For a moment, the studio lights seemed to grow hotter, the silence between questions stretching just a little longer, the polite chuckles of the crew fading into anxious stillness. Mark Wahlberg sat back in his chair, arms crossed, jaw set tight. The calm before the storm. George Stephanopoulos shuffled his cards deliberately, almost theatrically now, leaning forward as though savoring the moment. Well, Mark, George began, his voice soft but razor-edged, if we can pivot a bit, let's talk about the bigger picture of your career. You've made a lot of money, no question. You've stayed busy, no question. But critics, and let's be honest, some of your own peers, are saying you've become, shall we say, a little lazy with your choices. Mark's eyebrows shot up ever so slightly. Lazy? He repeated, the Boston in his voice flattening the word. Yes, George continued, his eyes narrowing as if delivering a final summation to a jury. Your recent films haven't performed spectacularly. They aren't exactly Oscar contenders anymore. Some would argue that you're coasting on your name, taking roles just to keep cashing checks, rather than pushing yourself artistically. You're making millions while other, more talented actors struggle to get those opportunities. That last phrase, more talented actors, seemed to hang in the air longer than anything so far. The crew collectively froze, camera operators hesitating over their shots. Even Mark, who had been holding himself with quiet composure, allowed a muscle in his jaw to tighten visibly. You really want to go there, huh? Mark finally said, his voice low but even, with a bitter laugh at the end. You sit here, behind this desk, in this nice warm studio, with a team of researchers feeding you lines. And you want to tell me about my work ethic? My talent? George didn't back down. In fact, he leaned in closer. Mark, I'm simply asking what a lot of people are already wondering. How much longer can you keep making movies that, frankly, don't matter? How much longer do you expect people to pay to watch you play the same tough guy in the same forgettable films? A faint murmur rippled through the crew. Mark took in a breath and let it out slowly through his nose. He forced a smile, though it was tight and didn't reach his eyes. I'll tell you something about those forgettable films, George, he said, his tone clipped now. You know who goes to see them? People like the ones I grew up with. People who don't care about Oscars or critics or whatever elite narrative you think defines art. People who want to feel seen, who want to feel like someone's telling their story. George interjected, almost cutting him off. And yet, they're the same people who end up watching glorified violence on screen. Thanks to you, that's really what your stories amount to, isn't it? Guns, fists, explosions, like you're teaching a whole generation that aggression solves problems. Mark's head tilted slightly. His eyes darkened, but his voice remarkably, stayed calm. You know what's funny about that? He said, leaning forward himself now. Every single one of those movies shows the cost of violence. Every single one. And if you actually watched instead of skimming headlines, you'd see that. But George pressed on, his tone now openly combative. Mark, do you really think you're helping anyone when you churn out these films? Some of your critics say you're just profiting off of perpetuating violence, that you're part of the problem. This time, Mark's expression hardened fully. His fingers drummed once on the armrest, then stilled. A long pause filled the studio. When he spoke again, his Boston accent was stronger, his voice sharper. I grew up in violence, George. I've seen what it does. To people, to families. My movies don't glorify it, they reflect it, and they remind people you can rise above it. But you, sitting here calling me part of the problem? He shook his head. You don't know the first thing about the world you're criticizing. The temperature in the room had dropped now, everyone holding their breath as George squared his shoulders and fired back. Well, if you really believe that, maybe you'd take a harder look at the messages you're sending, George said. And maybe, just maybe, you'd realize that cashing checks for playing the same violent roles over and over isn't helping anyone but yourself. For the first time, Mark's polite facade cracked. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, and fixed George with a stare so cold it made the host visibly stiffen. You don't get to talk to me about helping people, George, he said quietly, though the steel in his voice made it more menacing than a shout. You don't know what I've done for people. You don't know where I've been. You don't know what it costs to get here. And keep going. He sat back suddenly, almost too calmly, then with an icy smirk. But maybe you're just mad because nobody wants to see a movie about you. A gasp rippled through the crew, and even George froze for a second, caught off guard. But then George straightened his notes, forced a dry chuckle, and replied, That may be true, Mark, but at least nobody accuses me of teaching kids that fists fix everything. Mark's chair scraped softly against the floor as he stood up. Everyone knew what was coming next, but nobody moved. Yet, Mark Wahlberg sat rigid now, his back straight, eyes fixed on George. The tension in the studio so thick it nearly drowned out the low hum of the cameras. Around them, crew members stopped pretending they weren't watching, and even the teleprompter operator's finger hovered over the keyboard as if afraid to breathe. George, sensing his advantage, leaned forward, his voice dropping low, but carrying the smug sharpness of a man who believed he'd cracked his guest's armor. You see, Mark, George began, his tone patronizing, that's the problem with people in your position. You've gotten so used to being celebrated for mediocrity that you've started believing you're untouchable. Your last 3 movies underperformed, critics laughed at them, and here you are, still making millions. Meanwhile, there are actors out there delivering real performances and struggling to pay rent. Do you ever stop to think about what you've taken from more deserving talent? The question sat in the air like a slap. Mark's jaw tightened. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then, to everyone's surprise, he smiled. But it wasn't the usual confident Wahlberg grin. It was tight, cold, and entirely humorless. That's a hell of a thing to say, George, Mark said slowly, his Boston accent cutting through the silence. You think you know what I've earned? You think you get to decide who deserves what? You ever wake up at 4 a.m. and grind for years just to get one shot? You ever hear a casting director tell you to your face you're trash, only to come back and prove them wrong? Nah, you sit here in your nice studio with your notes and your questions, and you think you've built something. But you've never built a damn thing with your own 2 hands. George pressed on, emboldened by Mark's reaction. And now you're peddling more violence, George said, his voice rising, as though this was the moment he'd been waiting for all morning. Your latest film, another round of guns, fists, explosions. Do you know how many young men watch you and think that's what manhood looks like? Do you feel even a little bit guilty about pumping that garbage into the culture, Mark? Do you sleep well at night, knowing you're poisoning impressionable minds for a paycheck? It was as though the final fuse had been lit. Mark's eyes darkened, and his voice dropped to an almost terrifying calm. George, don't you dare, he said quietly. Don't you dare tell me who I am or what I represent. You've never been where I've been. You've never buried a friend because of the streets. You've never watched someone you love get chewed up and spat out by the system you claim to understand. My movies, yeah, they show violence, but they also show consequences. They show people fighting through impossible odds because no one else would fight for them. And if you can't see that, that's on you. George straightened, his hands gripping his cue cards like a man clinging to a shield. Sounds like excuses to me, he shot back. You're just another Hollywood millionaire who found a way to package aggression and sell it to the masses. And now you expect to be celebrated for it. Mark slowly rose to his feet. At first, the crew thought he might just tower over George and then let it end there, but then he reached up and unhooked his microphone, laying it carefully, almost ceremoniously on the desk. The room froze. He leaned down slightly, meeting George's gaze one final time. You know what, George? Mark's voice was deadly quiet now, but each word landed like a hammer. I've been called a lot of things in my life. Thug, criminal, has-been. But you just called me something worse. You called me a fraud. And that? He paused, shaking his head. That I won't sit here and let slide. George swallowed hard but tried to salvage the show. If you leave now, Mark, you're proving everything I just said about you. That you can't handle criticism. That you're just a glorified tough guy who cracks when it counts. Mark chuckled, but it was a sound without humor. You know what, George? This isn't criticism. This isn't journalism. This is just plain disrespect. He gave the cameras one final look, the look of a man who had nothing left to prove, and turned his back to the host, walking deliberately toward the exit. Roll your commercial, George, Mark called over his shoulder without turning back. You've got your soundbite. Hope it was worth it. The studio doors swung shut behind him with an audible click. For a long, awkward beat, the entire studio remained still. George sat frozen in his chair, his carefully constructed composure cracking ever so slightly as he stared down at the empty guest chair. Then, forcing a tight smile, he looked into the camera. We'll be right back. What did you think of this unforgettable clash? Did Mark Wahlberg overreact to George's tough questions? Or did George cross a line he couldn't come back from? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear what you think. And if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell for more explosive moments from the world of live television. Because sometimes the real drama happens off script.